Great. Thanks, Corey. Appreciate it. All right, folks, welcome back. Good to see everybody. Sign-in sheets going around. So discussion 5, I think it is. I'm trying to remember if it's numbered up properly, but 5 is out there, and the hope for today is to wrap up chapter 4. Wrap up coherence theory, moderate foundationalism, modest foundationalism, and then talk about chapter 5 ideally on Thursday. I'm still working on exams, so bear with me. It takes time to get these things graded, but I appreciate it. And what I'll try to do is include feedback, insert comments into each of your exams so that you can sort of see where things went right and where they didn't. Questions from you guys before we get back into it? Yeah, Anthony. Yeah.
It's not exactly related, but
yeah. So there's 2 exams and then a paper and then the discussion boards.
Okay.
And the thought is that each of those is roughly 25% of your grade. So that's why I encourage people to take the discussion boards seriously. I realize that for some folks that's hard if I'm not out there prodding them and replying to what they've said, but I do read them and gives me stuff to think about for our meetings. And it's a significant amount of your grade. So it's worth taking it seriously. And then so there'll be one more exam after the first one here. That'll cover however much we've gotten to. I'm sort of giving myself some wiggle room here. And then the final paper, and there's not a rough draft required, but I highly advise a rough draft of that. And so we've got next week's meetings and then spring break, if memory serves me. And I'll try to get some paper stuff together out there for you before spring break around that time so you can be looking at what I have in mind. And as far as the paper, again, probably 6 to 8 pages, 8 to 10. I mean, you know how these things go. It's not really a matter of how long they are. It's just a matter of the quality. And so certainly not something you need to pad, but it needs to be a substantial enough paper idea. Right? The good news is that if you're following the way Feldman sort of is going through things, then you know his style. And you know that it's okay to try to take a smaller point and really get it right. There's a lot of value in that. You know, sometimes people try to do too much in a paper, and they sort of overreach, and then you're making too many points, or you're not making them as well as you could. So that's stuff to keep in mind. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was thinking about that study group.
So,
yeah. You guys, if anybody's interested, maybe like a paper, like a peer review as well, getting a study group together, like really anytime works. Just get with me if anybody wants to help join up.
Yeah, I highly encourage you guys to do this. Corey was in my philosophy class last semester, and it was one of the people who was sort of in charge of heading it up, and that was a large lecture course, but it worked really well, and you got a pretty good turnout, and it definitely helps the people who attend. So I know everybody's busy, but if you've got the time in your schedule, let Corey know if you're interested and when you can do it. And I think that's a great idea. Gives you a chance outside of this context to ask questions and to be with your peers. And again, if you want to that'd be a great place to develop paper ideas. You know, you could even start there and say, hey, here I've got 2 pages of an idea for a paper. Would you mind reading it? And of course, I'm always available for that as well. I mean, you can email me. You can come see me in office hours. Cool. Very good. Other thoughts, questions? Okay. So last time we were working through coherentism, right, and getting kind of to the end of that theory. And recall, somebody want to help us out? I mean, it doesn't have to be like a formal statement, but what's the basic idea that coherence theorists have? Yeah, Anthony.
Only beliefs justify other beliefs.
Yeah. So one of the fundamental assumptions there is that only beliefs can do any kind of justificatory work, right? And moreover, that there aren't any beliefs that are justified solely just without some dependence on other beliefs, right? In other words, there aren't any basic beliefs. So the coherence theorist rejects that distinctive feature of the foundationalist program. And of course, we spent some time, Feldman spends a lot of time trying to get clear on exactly how to even formulate the theory. A lot of that work was done in a pretty exhaustive way at the time by Keith Lair and Larry Bonjour. and Bonjour is actually going to come up maybe again today at the end of the chapter, but Bonjour's book, The Structure of Empirical Knowledge, was kind of a foundational statement of coherence theory in the 1980s, and so that paved the way for a lot of thought. Interesting as a side note, Bonjour has since seen the light and changed his tune, and he's now a foundationalist. That was kind of a big thing in the world of epistemology, right? He's a nice guy. I mean, he's cool. So in any case, trying to figure out exactly how to state the theory in a way that doesn't lead to absurd problems, right? Like every belief becoming instantly justified just in virtue of being held, right? That's something that we looked at. And we ended up with a final kind of statement of it. And we talked about one objection, which is this alternative systems argument. Oops. Switch this over here. There we go. We talked a little bit about this idea, right? So we've got a version. Suppose you've got a workable version of the coherence theory, some statement of it. The details matter, but we can kind of play a little looser for now. The idea being, well, look, I mean, part of what, of course, enhances coherence is that more explanation gets done. So you've got some things that need to be explained, and you've got some things that are doing the explaining, right? These beliefs. And so a lot of this idea appeals, of course, to a lot of folks interested in the philosophy of science, where you might think that, hey, explanation is a big part of what we're trying to do here. And so a system that increases overall explanatory value is a better system as these things go, right? Justification goes up in systems where more gets explained. And so we've got this objection here, the idea that, well, look, I mean, if the coherence theory is true, then it looks like there could be alternative, incompatible coherent systems, right? And that's supposed to make trouble for the theory. And we talked about this a little bit, but I just wanted to see if people had any leftover thoughts or questions about the idea. Remember sort of Feldman's take on it, which is, anybody want to say what to think about the argument? So here's the version. If evidentialism is true, then whether belief's justified for a person or not depends. Well, don't use that argument. Use the. Let me see if I have it with me. I don't have the alternative systems argument handy, I don't think. This is the sort of rejoinder to that argument. Let's see if I happen to include it. Maybe it's in here. No, don't have it. But you remember how the argument works, right? We can read it from here, if you like. So it's over on page 67, the original statement of the argument, and this is a kind of, what I've got here is my sort of take on a response to the argument. So, argument 4.3, if the coherence theory is true, then a belief's justified if and only if it coheres with the believer's system of beliefs. A person can make any selected belief cohere with his system of beliefs by properly adjusting the rest. If that's true, then a person can make any selected belief justified by properly adjusting. Then here's the assumption to get for the reductio, right? But it's not the case that you could make any selected belief justified just by adjusting the rest, so the coherence theory is not true. Right? A basic reductio kind of argument. So what do people think about that? Feldman says sort of two things back to it. Good objection to the coherence theory? Not?
Yeah, I agree with Feldman on point 3 too.
Okay.
You can't, it's hard for me to believe that someone can just selectively pick and choose
right.
what they think is going to make their worldview, what they want it to be.
Yeah, I mean, Derek.
I was thinking about this before class. According to, going back to 3.2, is it based on, or is the theory based on a person's belief,
Oh, yeah. So while you're thinking about it, let me just sort of say something to Corey's point here. I mean, because that's one of the issues, right? I mean, the argument, and you might think, well, wait. I mean, is there a version of this objection that would work that doesn't assume some form of doxastic voluntarism, right? So I've got it up here since Feldman doesn't really take the time at this point in the chapter, but you could sort of think, well, hey, voluntarism itself is a huge topic. One view, I call it strong voluntarism, is the idea that people can literally choose to believe any proposition they want to. So I can just choose right now to believe that you guys aren't here in the classroom, or that it's raining really hard outside, or that the projector's not on. And of course, you get to a point, at least for me, where it's hard to know how to make any progress. I mean, if you've got someone who says, but I can do that, I really can. Like, I'm believing right now there's a purple elephant in the back corner of the room. I mean, people can say stuff like that, but that's not the same as it being true, right? I mean, very, very hard for me to get myself convinced of, say, the purple elephant belief. Now, are there things that we can do that can affect our beliefs? Of course, right? That seems like a much more plausible sort of take on the connection between how much control you've got and what you're believing. I can go flip the switch on the wall, and assuming I'm wired up properly and experiencing everything in a regular way, then probably in short order I'll get the belief that the lights are on. So I can do things to cause myself to get various beliefs, but this idea that I have sort of strong doxastic voluntaristic control, I think this is the outer edge of the view right here. Now, a weaker version, right, is that we have some kind of indirect control over our beliefs, and we can act in ways that'll, would nudge us or help us to get a belief in one direction or the other. I think that's more plausible. If you're interested in this topic, see me, email me, and I can send you some references. William Alston, Bill Alston's a famous, well-known influential epistemologist, was at Syracuse University forever, and he's written on this topic and done some really good work. And there's lots of, as you can imagine, it gets pretty fine-grained, trying to make lots of different distinctions. So that's one issue is, it seems like this version of the argument presupposes some version of voluntarism that's maybe not that plausible, and so you could criticize it that way. You could just say premise 3.2 is false, right? But as a side thought, again, you might think, and this could be a short paper idea that could be developed, hey, maybe there are versions of the coherence theory that can get around this objection by not assuming, or why saddle the coherence theorist with voluntarism? I mean, their primary goal is to provide a theory of justification. Why should they have to take a stand on the extent to which we have, right? So maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe you can get out of the argument that way. The coherence theorist might have a response, right? So Feldman doesn't think this is a good argument. He rejects that assumption of it. But there's also this other question, right, about, well, what's so bad about there being alternate, incompatible, justified systems of belief? Kind of seems like that's the world we're in. Some of this reminds me about Aaron's earlier point about, well, what do we do when we've got folks that go out of their way to try to isolate themselves from outside information and they want to stay insular? That seems to be a downside or a potential problem that evidentialism makes possible, right? It's not evidentialism's fault that people don't try to get additional evidence, but it does say what you're justified in believing with respect to a proposition at a time is whatever your total evidence supports, and it doesn't. And people can have misleading evidence. People can have evidence that's incomplete in various ways or slanted. Yeah.
So I was thinking about this in regards to the flat Earth movement.
Mm-hmm.
And say you have a kid who's brought up, and kind of how they talk about the non-standard Lincoln assassination thing.
Yeah.
Kid's brought up and is taught nothing but that the Earth is flat, and there's all this pseudoscience behind it. But they truly their total evidence points to that. How can that be epistemically justified if the truth value is still false?
So say again. There are folks out there, right, that believe this stuff, right? They just insist that the truth isn't the truth.
Yeah.
It seems kind of like a lot of what's going on out there nowadays.
Desirable.
That's justified? Yeah. Well, if that really is their evidence, some of these problems maybe boil down to empirical questions about. So the way I think about it, and again, this is a bit of of a digression, but I hope it's worthwhile, is there's, what evidentialism is a completely general theory of what you should believe with respect to a proposition at a time, right? Now, if somebody said, well, I want to know what am I really justified in believing right now? Which propositions are the ones that are justified for me? To me, that's not a purely philosophical question. So we have to tackle it in sort of two phases. One idea is, well, what is it that makes for justification to start with? What is justification? That's the philosophy part of it as I see it. That's largely a priori, armchair, conceptual analysis, necessary and sufficient conditions, thought experiments, consulting intuitions, the standard methods that we always use. But then if somebody were to go on and say, well, yeah, but that's great, Rick, but that's so abstract, that's not very much help. Am I justified right now in believing, that I'm in a room with other people as opposed to the matrix hypothesis? Well, that's a partly empirical question about exactly what your evidence supports. And your evidence consists of all of your other justified beliefs and or if you may want to qualify that and say, well, just all of your beliefs, maybe don't make them all justified, right? But it's all of your other beliefs and your experiences that determine that. So that's partly an applied epistemological question, kind of like applied ethics, right? I mean, if you want a general account of what makes wrong, right acts right or wrong acts wrong, and then you want to know whether some particular action performed by a person at a time is morally right or impermissible, got to look into the details. So as I see it, it's going to be a lot of that's going to become an empirical matter. In other words, we'd have to see what your actual evidence is. We'd have to, some psychologists or cog science people or the neuroscientist, if it turns out it's all just, states of your brain or something. So I don't know if that's very helpful. Yeah.
So is that when judging another person's, judging a proposition or judging a set of proposition or actions, is that all account?
Help me out a little bit more there. I want to understand. So yeah.
I mean, are you using the same ideology or theory to judge your own proposition or another person's action or proposition?
So see if great. So help me help you, and we'll see if we can get clear on this. So is the idea, does evidentialism apply in my own case as well as when I try to assess other people's levels of justification? Yeah. Well, so there's sort of two questions, I guess. I mean, when you're wondering whether someone else is justified in believing something, that it gets even harder, right? Because it's tough enough to figure out sometimes what you're justified in believing. For any sufficiently complicated question in life, there's probably going to be some reasons for thinking one way and some reasons for thinking that it's not that way, right? Because that's just, life is like that. And so you're trying to decide, right? So this is a crazy example, but it's philosophy. Think about Bigfoot, right? Now, I guess most folks probably say, that's silly, that's Bigfoot, there's no such thing. But there are serious people out there, maybe not the majority, but there are serious anthropologists, scientists, folks that are investigators looking into this stuff. And, again, the question of whether or not Bigfoot is real, there's reasons for thinking that no, it's not, there's no way or whatever, right? And then there's reasons for maybe, well, hey, here's some stuff that's kind of suggestive, some evidence that we can't quite square or that can't be explained away, or how do you account for this, right? So there's video footage, and there's first-hand reports, and there's tracks, and there's hair samples, and right, there's that kind of stuff, and then there's responses. So here you've got a kind of complicated situation, right? What the expert who has done nothing but study this forever, and they have an exhaustive knowledge of all the the sightings and the cases, they have a lot more evidence than I have. I just watched something on the Discovery Channel or National Geographic or whatever, right? And so I'm not, or if maybe you haven't even seen that much. Maybe you're someone who knows almost nothing and you just like the idea. It's exciting to think that there's still some wild stuff out there that we don't know at all or whatever, right? So that maybe the idea of that could lead someone through wishful thinking to want to believe it, right? So if that's what they've got, as opposed to the expert, and then sort of the folks in the middle who know a little bit but not much, I think that the justificatory status of the Bigfoot belief is going to be different for each of them. So, think about it like with kids, right? I mean, take small children, their grasp, their understanding, their conceptual framework isn't what you'd expect of an adult. And yet they still manage to get justified beliefs about things. Do they turn out to be wrong a lot of times? Yeah. But so do we. Right? I mean, on matters large and small. I mean, if it's something as simple as, getting the movie times wrong, you're justified but mistaken. Or if it's something big where a lot depends on the outcome. Right? So I guess, I don't know if that's answering your question, but I think evidentialism can say what needs to be said.
Because the more I read it, it seems like it's less, reading is less about me. It's more about me making judgments
About other people?
Getting better clarified evidence and just based on other things.
Yeah, you might wonder, if somebody has a view that's totally radical by your standards, so there's somebody out, and we find that all the time as well, right? People disagree, and they disagree a lot on all manners of things, right? So here you are, you've got your view on whatever the topic is, make it something, some moral status of the death penalty. So some people are against it under all circumstances. I'm picking something like that that's outside of epistemology. Still something significant. It's moral philosophy, right? So not really trying to answer the question about its moral status, but just to have an example. So there's folks that are against it in a very extreme way, and then there are folks, I assume there's going to be some people that are much more permissive with respect to their views on it. So maybe, I don't know, Texas, it's a state where I think they seem to be inclined to use the death penalty, right? You're wondering about the moral status of it, and so you try to form your belief on the basis of your best evidence. Sometimes it means suspending judgment and awaiting additional evidence, and this is again back to Aaron's earlier point, you might think, there's no end to this. You could just keep stalling out with suspending on everything, trying to learn more and more and more about it, but the reality is that you can't be an expert on everything. And some of this discussion of expertism kind of plays into one of the questions about modest foundationalism or moderate foundationalism that Feldman brings up at the end, right? When you're talking about what counts as a proper response to a perceptual experience. The expert and the novice, they both look at the same thing, let's say, and the one gets justified in a belief that the other isn't. But yeah, I hope, is that helping any? Yeah, I know for sure I don't want evidentialism to come off as a kind of authoritarian epistemology. It's not designed to be that, and it's certainly not. And I can speak with some authority on this just because I know I've had conversations with Feldman about this, that he's concerned he wouldn't want his view to be misunderstood that way. He has a paper called Authoritarian Epistemology, and his view is that different folks differently situated with different bodies of evidence can and often are going to end up being justified in believing different things. But the hope is that as you, and this is, again, this may be idealistic, especially given the level of kind of social discourse and political discourse that we're experiencing now. But the hope is you get the folks who disagree together and talk about it. And each side, not in a debate where somebody's trying to win or beat the other person. That's not the spirit of philosophy. It's about trying to get at the truth, right? To try to be as impartial and unbiased and, someone who's pursuing the truth at all costs kind of thing. You get those folks together and they discuss it and they each present their evidence or what they think their best reasons are for their belief, and then you see. Now, there's no guarantee even then when you try to share evidence, something that you think is evidence or a good reason strikes the other person as not evidence or not a good reason. So where do you go at that point? More discussion, hopefully. But that may be an idealistic hope at this point, since if you pay attention to what's going on at the popular level, often it's just kind of folks yelling at each other, right, back and forth, the political pundits and the TV folks and stuff. So that's not maybe where our best chance of getting good, deep discussions of these things come from, I suppose. Yeah, Anthony?
I have a question sort of based on your product. Like the kid being brought up their product.
Yeah.
Would it be, I guess, right to call that belief is justified if you learn that belief from other people's beliefs who were maybe not as justified?
Yeah, so you're worried that he's part of a flat earth community and the people, all the adults there and the teachers there they've taught him that, but of course maybe the status of those beliefs for them was kind of shaky too.
Would it be correct to say that his belief is justified based on his evidence, but his evidence would rely on their beliefs?
Yeah. Well, you see where we're headed, right? This is playing right into problems about testimony and testimonial knowledge. So if you're interested in that topic, that's, again, it'd be a great one for a final paper, and I can send you to some places. There's a lot of stuff out there on that. I'm not sure what I think. I mean, it's a hard question with testimonial knowledge. Part of it is we can't get away from it. It's inevitable that we're going to have to rely on each other as well. And by testimony, again, I mean it to be understood very broadly. So you read it on the internet, somebody texted it to you, a political figure told you, religious authorities, your parents, your friends, right, your teachers. When you believe stuff on the basis of the say-so of some putative source, then you'd like to think that, well, it's only as good as the credentials of the source. So, people who don't know very much about the subject but have views on the subject, you worry that beliefs based on their say-so, aren't going to have much by way of epistemic justification. But again, I'm not trying to dodge the problem, which we all know, namely that experts disagree. Right? So you get a whole bunch of experts in physics together, a whole bunch of experts in biology, or a whole bunch of experts in history, philosophy. These folks, now some areas may be more prone to disagreement than others, but I have to think that at the edge of all of those disciplines, where the current work is being done, the bleeding edge, the state-of-the-art stuff, there's going to be disagreement because that's how theories get sorted out. It's how we make progress in the sciences, right? You've got competing explanations, competing theories, and each of the groups pursues their research program and shares their results, and then they try to reproduce this stuff, and hopefully it gets sorted out. But I mean, I would be concerned that you might think, look, justification can only go down in cases like that. So if you're thinking about transmission, which is what they call that in the testimony literature, there's lots of questions about these transmission principles. Right? So what happens when you get it from somebody who doesn't know that much and you believe it on that basis, right? And then you share it with somebody else. It seems like we're kind of multiplying fractions or something, right? It's going to go down. I don't know if that's helpful. But, I mean, if you're interested in that, let's talk, because testimony's hard. It really is. I mean, in some ways, perceptual knowledge used to seem like that was the really hard one. A lot of epistemologists were really preoccupied with trying to understand perceptual knowledge, empirical knowledge, simple stuff, a cup on the table. How is it that we get that? Partly because perception's its own thing in the sciences, right? I mean, you can study that in psychology, biology, neuroscience. But also because philosophers have been preoccupied with responding to skeptical arguments, and the most radical kinds of skepticism challenge our most fundamental basic beliefs about the world around us, right? That we really can't distinguish reality from mere perception or sensation. Right? So, but testimony certainly is a concern, since it seems like we can't do without it, and lots of questions about how it works, for sure. Yeah. So in any case, I mean, thoughts on, I mean, here's a kind of the rejoinder argument to this whole thing, right? That, well, look, I mean, if evidentialism is true, then whether a person's justified depends on their total evidence, and, you know, that consists of all their beliefs and experiences, and of course, different people can have different evidence. I don't think we should make more of it than we have to. I mean, if you pick radically different cultures and people from radically different times, right? So you've got contemporary American society, and then you've got the medievals, and then you go back to antiquity. Yeah, there are lots of room for differences in background beliefs and what they think they know about the world. But you'd like to think that within, you know, and again, this may be wishful thinking, that within, you know, folks, say all of us in this room here, there's a lot we can agree on. So I don't want to make too much of the idea that everybody's justified in believing all these different things. I mean, we're all, you know, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of consensus here based on a shared body of evidence. When you get to things like politics and morality, religion, social matters, it's a lot harder there. Right? I think it becomes more challenging because the concepts are tougher concepts than you know, the couple on the table is the projector on, that sort of thing. Let me show you this other objection here that Feldman talks about, and this he does think is a good objection to coherentism. And this has received a fair amount of attention as well. My buddy Earl Connie wrote a really cool paper called Isolation and Beyond. I think it's in Phil Studies. Trying to basically make trouble for the coherence theory by coming up with a really good version of the isolation objection. Then you can see, again, a lot of work goes into trying to come up with the very best versions of these objections and these responses, so you're not just spinning your wheels on a kind of straw man argument. Anybody remember the example that he uses in this case? It's kind of comical. This is the Magic Feldman, Magic Johnson. Yeah, somebody read it for us. I just like hearing it read. It's kind of comical. Have that for.
Sure. The strange case of Magic Feldman. Professor Feldman is a rather short philosophy professor with a keen interest in basketball. Magic Johnson, MJ, was an outstanding professional basketball player. For playing a game, we may suppose MJ had a fully coherent system of beliefs. Magic Feldman, or MF, is a possible, though unusual character who is a combination of professor and the basketball player. MF has a remarkable imagination, so remarkable that while actually teaching a philosophy class, he thinks he is playing basketball. Indeed, he has exactly the beliefs MJ has, because MJ's belief system was coherent, MF's belief system was also coherent.
Yeah, so here's the statement of the argument, right? Interesting kind of case. Rich is a huge basketball fan, so it makes it even funnier. If the coherence theory is true, then in all possible cases, a belief is justified if and only if it coheres with the believer's system of beliefs. Magic Feldman's system equals Magic Johnson's system, right? If Magic Johnson's belief that he's playing basketball coheres with his system of beliefs, Magic Feldman's belief he's playing basketball coheres with his. So if the coherence theory is true, then Magic Feldman's belief is justified, but by hypothesis, assumption for the argument, right, he's not justified, in part because since, according to the coherence theory, nothing but beliefs can do any work, right, can do any of the justifying, seems like it just disregards or leaves experience, how things look or how things seem, to Professor Feldman is just sort of not addressed, right? So it looks like his belief's not justified, so you're able to get the conclusion, right? This objection will get us to the conclusion here that the coherence theory is false. So Feldman likes this objection, but he does acknowledge that it's, you know, it's extreme. I mean, part of it is, you know, making it fun and lively for the reader. But it does seem like you can come up with more sort of down-to-earth examples. There's the psychology experiment, next page over, where expectation seems to play a role, right? So you've got the two subjects, lefty and righty, and they're each told ahead of time they're going to see two lines and told which one's going to be longer, and they do it, but at the last minute they don't make the line look longer to the one it does to the other, but the one still insists that it looked longer. It does seem like expectations playing a role there. But again, the point is to just how much of a contribution perceptual experiences seem to make to whether we're justified in these kinds of beliefs. And this is a problem for the coherence theory, I think. They need a way to try to take into account these appearance states. And I had worked for a while to try to figure out a way to do that. I mean, appearance states aren't beliefs, right? So the theory would have to be revised to accommodate that. And as Feldman notes at the end, it looks like if you want to try to build something like that into the coherence theory, then it seems like you're dangerously close to just coming up with a version of foundationalism, or basically acknowledging that part of the foundationalist idea was right after all, that experiences need to be part of the mix. So thoughts, questions on the isolation objection? All right, so on to the last little part here, which is if the coherence theory is not going to work, and our choice is essentially assuming that infinitism's not on the table, right? Going back to the regress argument, then it looks like some version of foundationalism is probably the right way to go. So according to moderate foundationalism, which beliefs are going to be the basic ones? Well, spontaneously formed beliefs on potentially any topic. So this is kind of a huge change to the original Cartesian picture, right? According to, think back to how it works, right? If you're Descartes, if you're a classical foundationalist, then the basic beliefs are appearance beliefs, right? So you end up with that structure that I've sort of had before. We've got the experiences down here, and those give rise to appearance beliefs, which is just a kind of technical term describing beliefs whose content only refer to how things look or seem to the subject to be. And then the appearance beliefs are going to help to justify our external world beliefs. That's the sort of the picture. So experiences, beliefs solely about how things seem to you to be or appear to be, and then ultimately you get to the cup on the table. Right? And of course, the connection here between this level and the top level has to be deductive. Right? And the reason why these are supposed to be basic is because they're what? On the classical picture. What if this is the Cartesian picture, right? Working our way to the modest picture here. The appearance beliefs are infallible, right? So these guys are going to, and that's what credentials them. And we've seen some objections along the way, right? So that's the old picture. Imagine, though, if we just kind of cut this level right here out, right? And just allow, since, for one thing, these seem problematic in various ways that we saw. I mean, I still like them. I still think they're kind of a cool class of beliefs. And certainly if you're sympathetic to the Cartesian mindset and you like this idea of starting from what you can be absolutely certain about on the assumption that you can be certain about your own internal states and then trying to axiomatize a way to get out of that Cartesian circle, right? That's great. But if it doesn't work, either because there are not enough of these things or they're not infallible, right? Then it would seem like we could just bypass this step right here and do it like that. So the basic beliefs on the moderate picture turn out to be spontaneously formed beliefs on potentially any topic, right? So my belief right now that there's a cup on the table, that's a basic belief, right? Or at least a candidate basic belief for the moderate foundationalist, which seems to be a good thing for a number of different reasons. In terms of the psychological reality, insofar as that matters to the kind of theorizing we're doing, it doesn't seem like people typically go through this sequence, right? I mean, if these things are there at all, they're there, in a philosophy classroom where we're trying to kind of make sense of this picture. In everyday life, you're navigating around in your environment, you're bombarded with various sensory stimuli, right? And you form the belief in response to having a certain visual experience. There's a couple on the table. So that gets to be a basic belief. What makes the basics justified according to this picture? Well, you can see here, right? They're supposed to be direct, proper responses to one's experience. And of course, Feldman spends a fair amount of time, right, talking about, and there's a lot of hard discussion there. And we can have some of that if people want to. And then finally, what's the connection? So everything gets changed up here, right? We get rid of the middle level, which seem to present a number of different problems and questions. We're able to go directly from a proper response to an experience to the target external world belief. What makes these things basic? Well, there'll be some hand waving and the details have to be filled in, but they're spontaneous and they're appropriate. They're the ones that intuitively you should get. So when it looks the way my visual experience is looking right now, the right thing for me to think is there's a cup on the table in front of me. Right? And then finally, how do we get from these basics to the superstructure? This would be a basic, of course, right? So how do we go further out? Well, it's going to be inductive, which is good as well because, we've already seen it looks like there's no way to do it deductively. All the experiences that you're having right now, that I'm having right now, don't logically guarantee that they're true, right? That the experiences are veridical or that the beliefs that result from them are true. And we'll see this when we get to chapters 6 and 7 and start thinking about skepticism. So a number of questions come up here, right? And Feldman talks about some of this. One of the big ones, of course, is what makes a given response proper, right? And he comes up with a couple of revisions as well. I'll show you these. So he ends up kind of modifying. The first proposal is, well, which beliefs would be the basic ones? Well, any spontaneously formed belief on any topic, well, that's not going to be enough. Seems like you can get counterexamples there, right? So random or crazy spontaneous beliefs. Suppose here I'm having I'll just stick with this sort of example since I use it all the time. I'm justified in believing that there's a cup or a mug, coffee mug, whatever you want, on the table here. But am I justified in believing that it's a 12-year-old coffee cup or mug? Right? I might be because it's mine. I know the history, but none of you would be justified in that, right? Likewise, some even more sort of crazy, spontaneously formed belief. Imagine someone in the throes of some sort of psychosis or something, right? Who just has crazy beliefs pop into their head, as unfortunately happens. Those wouldn't be justified. Presumably they're not proper, right, in that case. So we're going to have to say, something there. So what do we do? A lot of these crazy, random, spontaneous beliefs are probably going to be the result of wishful thinking or some other kind of distortion, right? And presumably they'd be defeated by other evidence that the person has. So if you suddenly form the belief, about the purple elephant in the back of the room, the problem is that one, it doesn't look that way, right? And that would seem to count as a pretty big defeater for your justification in that belief like that. So here we go to moderate foundationalism, the revision. What about that? Well, again, there could be inadequately supported beliefs or things that go beyond one's evidence. And you can see there's some finessing going on here. I mean, if you read through the chapter a couple times kind of slowly and think about what he's saying, I mean, he acknowledges here that there are puzzles because you want to, in order to get the beliefs justified, they can't go beyond your evidence, right? You might be justified in more than you're believing or believing more than you're justified in. So you got to get the fit right. and that turns out to be kind of hard here. So you might have beliefs that they're not strictly speaking defeated for you, but they're just not supported one way or the other, right? So take the Tate Street coffee cup example. I got a lot of beliefs about it, some more justified than others. I don't really have any evidence one way or the other concerning where it was manufactured. It was made somewhere, some plant. They have, they do it. If I were to form the belief not only that there's a cup on the table and a Tate Street coffee cup, but that the cup was manufactured in Peoria, Illinois, right? I'm not justified in that one. It's not that it's defeated for me per se. I don't have any evidence one way or the other. So that would seem to be reading too much into the experience, right? So then that gets us down to the final revision, and you see the process here. For me, it's as much about exposing you guys to that as the content in some cases, because I'd like to be able to see people try to incorporate this into their own writing and their own philosophy. So here's another revised version, right? All spontaneously formed beliefs that are properly responsive and not defeated by other evidence that the person has. So they need to be responsive in the right way. That's the sort of sticking point. And now there is this kind of example it's been discussed some in the literature. And it has to do with this idea of proper responsiveness to one's experience. There's that Rain Man example. People remember that at all? Feldman doesn't discuss it in the book, but you saw Rain Man, I'm assuming. So there's that scene where the toothpicks fall on the floor, right? And I haven't watched it in a million years, so I can't remember. I can't quote it. But toothpicks fall on the floor, and he looks at this. He has a certain visual experience, and Tom Cruise is right there, and he looks at it too. And Rain Man says, 62, 62, 62, whatever, and says what the number is of toothpicks. And Tom Cruise, of course, presumably he can't do that. He's not Rain Man. There's been some discussion of that in this context because people sort of wondering, well, is Rain Man justified in that belief about the number of toothpicks on the floor, and Tom Cruise isn't? And I think the way it works is that the number he says isn't the number on the box, but then they look in the box and there's 2 left in the box, so he actually was right. It's supposed to add up, get you to think, wow. It didn't take him very long, right? We each look at the same, presumably have a sort of the same perceptual experience. I get justified in believing that number of toothpicks is on the floor, and or Rain Man does and I don't. What do we want to say about cases like that? Does it really look different to Dustin Hoffman? Right? Is his visual experience, it's easy to say, well, it looks the same to both of them, but the one's justified and the other's not. Does it look the same? I don't know. I don't want to pick on the example too much. Obviously, Rain Man's an exotic case, right? He's a savant and he has these exceptional abilities. So, closer to home, of course, the same sort of thing comes back around with the expert and the novice, right? So the bird identification example, I think, is the one that Rich uses, right? Let's see where that is. It does the trees as well. Yeah, Jerry Fodor discusses that one too. So, what did people think about that? Puzzles, thoughts, questions? I wish I had something really great to say in response to. That's a legitimate topic. If anybody wants to try to take it up and pick a paper or two in the literature that tries to address some of this and criticize it or defend it against some sort of objection, I think that could make for a pretty good paper. So this, again, I don't think this is meant to be an objection to moderate foundationalism so much as a request for additional clarification. Like, we need more details. We want to know how this theory works, right? So I don't see this as necessarily bad news for the approach, and I embrace this approach. If somebody said, "What are you, Rick?" I'm a moderate foundationalist. For what it's worth. I normally don't tip my hand like that, but we're far enough along. So yeah, I think this seems to me to be the most promising way to go. But there there are details and wrinkles that have to be ironed out for sure. Thoughts? Yeah, Derek.
It's just the proper response plan to me. It's just like, what is that?
What counts as a proper response? Yeah, I know it's problematic, right? But I feel like what you want to say, or what a lot of us want to say, is, well, I mean, obviously, the expertise factors in here, and so for people that are experts, you know, I don't know anything about bird identification. I don't know anything about tree identification. I have very, very rudimentary knowledge. I mean, I'd embarrass myself if I try to come up with an example. That's how bad, right? Those just aren't my things, right? But, pick some, but everybody's got something. Some people are really good at identifying pieces of music. Some people can taste subtle differences between different kinds of varietals of wine, right? Some people are really great at identifying art. They just look at it and can tell. So even within Impressionism, they know they can tell the style. These are the folks that have to do a lot of the authenticating. Antiques, same sort of thing. Some people can just look at it and they know it's an antique, and somebody else looks at it and they don't get justified in believing anything about the provenance or the manufacturer of it or anything. So clearly expertise plays a big role here. And I guess part of the question is, does the background knowledge, training, practice of the expert actually shape the way it looks to them? Or does it still pretty much look the same to the expert and to the novice? It's just that all of that additional information plays into what they get justified in believing, and also what they can say about their experience, right? So sometimes people that have that level of expertise can take a non-trained person and show them what to look for, right? That's part of the thing about experts. Say, well, let's listen to this piece of music again, and now I want you to pay attention to what's happening, with the woodwinds, or pay attention to the timpani. Notice how the triangle comes in here, just this part. And so they try to teach you what to listen for, right? I mean, I think that's part of, and so then maybe your own experience gets transformed and gets shaped as you practice. You're able to tell differences. But yeah, it's a hard question. Are you just puzzled over like, well, what counts as proper?
Yeah, what counts as proper? I mean, it seems like they could just go far left or far right. I mean,
Yeah, like proper for. Yeah, it's obviously you're going to have to pick some reference group, right? So if it's people that they're candidates for a job at Christie's auction house or Sotheby's, these are the big antique auction houses, right? Knew a guy who was a coin collector and got a job doing that. That's what he does. He's rare metals and coins and can appraise, so, can look at these things and tell you right away, right? Years and years and years of practice go into being able to do it quickly like that and get it right and be reliable. So if your reference group are, antique appraisers and collectors and people like that, that's one reference group. If it's just folks at the flea market Sunday in Thomasville, I mean, it's going to be different. It's a different group of people, right? Nothing against Thomasville. I live in High Point. They're all good. But yeah, so it's a different, sixth graders versus 40-year-olds versus people that are, they're experts. They've been doing this forever. That's all they do. I think within a certain, you'd have to pick a reference group, and then there'd be standards, and so there's interesting, tough questions here. I mean, certainly part of it is just the puzzle of wanting to know whether or not it actually looks the same or not. Because I think a lot of these examples, the way they slide by is you bite and you say, yeah, it looks the same to Tom Cruise as it does to Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man, right? Well, maybe, I don't know. I mean, that's such a hard example because, Dustin's character is very, very rare kind of capacities, right? I mean, so that's a harder one to know about. And even in the more mundane examples there, I mean, the expert brings a lot to bear on the experience, and it may. I mean, I'm open to the idea that it could actually impact and change how they perceive it, right? the expert wine taster and the person who has never tasted any wine, they taste the same glass of wine. It seems like it's going to be a little different. Yeah.
Say an expert gets it wrong, or is like.
And they do.
Yeah.
Right? In these double-blind controlled things, they make mistakes too.
So would that count as a proper response, even though, like, maybe he thinks he's correct, but he's drawing a blank, sort of?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Assesses the knowledge.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Thanks, Anthony. I'm glad you're thinking about it like that. So yeah, I mean, does the fact that somebody's an expert or supposed to be an expert, and that they're having, they form their belief according to, they form their belief in this way, or rather, let me put it back up here. According to MF2B here, right? So they satisfy this, right? Is moderate foundationalism committed to the idea that belief, that justified basic belief, has to be right? No. Shouldn't be. We wouldn't want it to be. Because even the experts can be fooled. They can make mistakes. I mean, it happens. How many times have you gone to the doctor for something? Right? The doctor's the expert, let's suppose. You've got a scratchy throat, you're congested, a little achy, no fever, it's flu season. Just on the safe side you go. Doctor checks you out and says, it's probably just a viral thing. It's just a cold. Don't worry about it. You're all right. You go home 3 days later. You got a fever. I mean, so no, it was the flu. I mean, it happens. You may say, well, they weren't an expert enough. Well, you got to go to the CDC. You got to find somebody, But I think that at some point we just have to acknowledge our fallibility, as human beings, even those who strive for expertise in an area. It's never going to be 100%. But I think that's probably the way it needs to be. Right? I mean, it accommodates what we know about our own experience in the world, even when we think we know a lot about things. Better to be kind of humble and let's go slow here and make sure that we're getting it right, rather than just jump right in and make mistakes. Does that help any?
Yeah, I was thinking, I guess because they, I don't know, I was looking at the not defeated by other evidence the person has. And I guess it would be defeated that their mistake would be defeated by that, so they would have gotten it wrong.
No, so here's the idea. Let's just work through it. Thanks for staying on me here. So they have a proper response to the experience, and it's not defeated by any other evidence that they've got available to them at the time. So they go ahead and they form that belief. Well, that's not like they go ahead and form it. They get the belief. Right? It's a spontaneously formed thing. That's why it's not part of the old picture. Right? And it doesn't seem to be. There may not be any trouble with voluntarism or anything here. There's not supposed to be. So you just get the belief, let's suppose. It's a proper response, whatever that means. That has to be cashed out, and it's not defeated by any other evidence that the person has, which would have taken out MF2A, that middle level, right? But there's no guarantee that they get it right. Right? They could still turn out to be wrong, because keep in mind that the defeaters would have to be things that, just being wrong is not a defeater, right? So what we're imagining here is they've actually got, they've got other evidence that would suggest that they should hold off, right? So that's the way the example's supposed to work. You're looking at, you're trying to, you form the belief that the painting's a Chagall based on just a first glance at it. It just looks like what Chagall would paint, right? You're an enthusiast for this stuff. And, you have no at that point, your belief's undefeated. But suppose you've been sitting there for the past 2 hours watching people that seem to know a lot about art go up and try to guess these things, right? That's just it's a show, who knows, tell a story. And there's been a whole bunch of and they're going through Impressionists now or whatever, and a bunch of people are getting it wrong. And these things look like dead ringers for who they say they are, right? But they're a bunch of they're copies, right? They're all fakes or whatever. Or many of them are. Enough of them are to where that's all now part of your evidence. So when you have that spontaneously formed belief and your first impression is, oh, it's got to be Chagall, you've also got some more evidence available to you, which is, I've been sitting here for the past 2 hours with a bunch of people that seem to know as much about it as me, and 75% of them are getting it wrong. Maybe that's a defeater for that belief. Maybe I'm not justified at that point. You know. So, I mean, I think that that's the way I think it's supposed to work. I don't know if that is it making it seem better or worse. Yeah. So I mean, the idea is that these defeaters are things that are part. I mean, they're not just floating around in the ether out there, some true statement that worry you to add it, but rather you've actually, because I mean, it's easy to just pay attention to a part of one's evidence. We all do this, right? I mean, especially when it's something we really care about how it turns out. You focus on the parts, that support what you want to believe. I mean, we're human beings after all. So, they're supposed to. You really want to you really want to believe a certain thing, and then you search around and find the parts of your evidence that are congenial and supportive, and you kind of minimize or push away the parts of your evidence that don't really support or fit your view. That's misevaluating one's total evidence. And that's not what evidentialism says makes for justified beliefs. It's got to be the total evidence condition. So what I think that, and I'm glad you brought this up, though, I think what this shows is that, there's the kind of defeaters that are in question here are, other pieces of information that the person has, not just some true statement out there like, oh, by the way, that's your belief's false. Maybe he shouldn't have used the word defeat here on the heels of just talking about the no defeaters approach to solving the Gettier problem, because there the defeaters were cashed out in terms of these subjunctives, right? Some true statement such that were it to be added to the person's evidence. But here we're imagining that no, I mean, the person's actually got as part of their evidence reasons for thinking, that conflict with the spontaneously formed belief. That's the idea, at least. So, thoughts, questions? Let me show you, just in the interest of time, this last little bit. And I've got a bunch on this if we wanted to do it, but I kind of think a little bit of this goes a long way. So, here's this argument from Larry Bonjour, again, kind of a big wig in the world of coherence theory, who's changed his mind now. And this is this is the truth indicative feature argument. This is the bottom of 76, where Feldman kind of builds it up. And there's a blurb starting over on the bottom of 75 going to the top of 76. A little quote from Bonjour there. And he's a good philosopher. I've always liked him. I think he's a high quality guy. But this argument's supposed to make trouble, right? And the idea is, look, for any proposition, this is the truth indicative feature argument. For any proposition a person believes, either the person has a truth indicative feature argument for that proposition or they don't. If S has the truth indicative feature argument, then S's belief supported by the argument, and it's not a justified basic. If they don't have it, right, then S's belief's not justified, and it's not a justified basic. So either way, it looks like it's not a justified basic belief. This is supposed to be an objection to any form of foundationalism, and Feldman considers it here at the end during this discussion of moderate foundationalism. So the argument, again, it's a valid argument. If the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. Any objection is going to have to focus on the premises here, right? Anybody want to say anything about it? Like it, love it, hate it, get it, don't get it? I mean, you can sort of, so the idea behind the truth indicative feature is whatever it is in virtue of which the belief gets justified, right? The person has to, in some sense, know that that's what's doing the work, right? They have to be aware that beliefs of that sort have that feature, and moreover, it's that feature in virtue of which the belief is justified. Right? But you might already be thinking, well, wait a minute. I mean, this seems to be kind of conflating two things, right? There's whether or not the feature's present, and if it is, and that's the justifying feature, that's the justification conferring property or whatever, then isn't that good enough? Why does why saddle the person with this additional requirement? I mean, maybe that's appropriate in a philosophy classroom or something where you're supposed to be given reasons for the things you say, right? But in an everyday, ordinary kind of case, would seem to be enough that, the person forms the belief in the right way, right? And the belief, in fact, does enjoy the truth indicative feature, whatever it is, it has it, right? Then, whether the person can produce this second argument for the beliefs having that would seem to be just an extra thing. It's nice if you can do it, right? In a weird way, it's kind of almost like, it seems like this argument's requiring that everybody be an epistemologist before they can get any justified beliefs. That's too much to ask. I mean, as an epistemologist, that's like a fantasy world for me, right? But that's not the way it works, and I don't think it would have to. It need not work that way. Right? I mean, for those who want to think about knowledge and reflect on how it is they know, and if they know that they know, and what it is that justifies their beliefs, then this is the enterprise for that. But for ordinary folks in everyday life, just navigating around in the world, they get lots of justified beliefs. They're rational a lot of the time. Not all the time. They make mistakes. They get things wrong. We all do. But, that you shouldn't have to be an epistemologist and have some meta argument about beliefs of a certain sort having a certain epistemic credential, and this is a belief of that sort, so this has got it. That's just making it really kind of cumbersome. And I think Feldman says as much in his response to Larry on this point. So I don't know that there's a lot here. There's a kind of, you can see I've got some stuff out there on Canvas. I think I put it out there for you. A kind of fuller statement, like a 3-page statement of Bonjour's actual argument, where I try to break down what he's doing in those passages there and separate it out. But it seems to me like I think Feldman's got the right response here on this one. Thoughts, questions? Everybody convinced and going to embrace moderate foundationalism now? I hope. Just kidding.
Only if I can figure out what a proper response is.
Only if you can figure out proper responses. Yeah, to experience. Well, it's it's some wiggle room there, right? I mean, understandably so. I mean, presumably there are folks, and again, this is where some of this maybe shades off into empirical projects that interest people. People get into different things, right? So somebody said, well, look, I mean, what is it in virtue of Rick's experience right now that makes the belief that the cup is on the table basic for him? Well, that's a belief about the external world. It's not a belief about my own experience. I'm having a certain visual experience. Why is that belief right now properly responsive? Well, one approach would be to say, well, let's do this. Let's take 100 people, orient them all in a similar sort of way with respect to the cup and the table. We'll put some equipment on their brains, some EEG equipment, right? And we'll scan them while they're doing this. We'll put them in functional MRIs or PET scanners or whatever, and scan them while we show them stuff, and we'll get a baseline for what normals are like when bombarded with different kinds of perceptual stimuli. And that's what they're doing, right? I mean, that's part of the project. And so then you can say, well, we've scanned 10,000 people, and this is the normal range. This is what quote-unquote normals come back with when they're shown, given this particular perceptual stimulus. And then they're going to be the outliers, right? So I think you've got a really good question there. I'm just, as a philosopher, I'm more than happy to hand it off to people in biopsychology or cognitive science or neuroscience, the folks that are going to do the wet work, as it were. Because I really think that'll be part of the story now. And then you can say, okay, it's an experience is properly responsive if and only if it's formed in the following. And that's part of what we're going to see in Chapter 5, is with this kind of externalist sort of approaches, these non-evidentialist ways of thinking about justification. So all that's out there in the new discussion board. If you haven't posted on it yet, if you can do so before our next meeting, that'll help me, because I'll be reading what you say to think about how what I want to focus on in Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is not as long and difficult as the one we just finished here, but I will say this: some of those externalist approaches are complicated. So the causal theory, he sort of takes them, I guess, kind of in order. The causal theory is sort of the most straightforward. Nozick's truth tracking theory can get kind of weird because it involves some conditionals again. Plantinga's proper functionalism is complicated. There are a lot of moving parts to that view, and it's, again, one that's gotten a lot of attention. 3 books Plantinga wrote dedicated to trying to develop and defend that view. And then finally, Alvin Goldman's ultimate sort of end-run theory, I think, is reliabilism, process reliabilism. Again, there's a lot of moving parts there, and fun stuff to think about. So maybe not as long, but worth reading more than once, for sure. Other thoughts, questions? All right. Well, cool. Thanks, folks. It was good to see you. I'll see you next time.